Bonjour, bonjour à toutes et à tous. Merci d'avoir répondu à
Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for taking up this invitation to EnerGaïa. We're going to be talking about agrivoltaics. We'll be speaking about this matter with a number of guests. Olivier DAUGER, who is co-general manager of France Agrivoltaisme. He works with the farmers of France Agrivoltaisme, and he is joining me up here on the podium. He'll talk about agrivoltaics and the decree in France. The next guest has a number of projects. I'd like to welcome the General Manager of Sun Agri, Cécile MAGHERINI. Thank you for being with us, Cécile. You're going to talk about your experience and the promising economic results, how you combine agrivoltaics and farming. And just to give us a scientific perspective, we'll welcome Christian DUPRAZ. Thank you for being with us, researcher at INRAE, the State Research Institute for Sustainable Development of Agriculture, Food and the Environment. And also, to spell out the potential of agrivoltaics, we'll be welcoming Michel GIORIA, Executive Officer, France Renouvelables. This roundtable will be divided up into three parts. So we'll talk about the challenges and opportunities of agrivoltaics for agriculture and solar energy. Then we'll talk about the criteria for a sustainable agrivoltaic model. And finally, we'll talk about the acceptability of these agrivoltaic projects and the sharing out of value. And then, of course, the audience will be able to react. You'll be able to ask any questions you may have at the end. And thank you for coming in such large numbers. You're here because clearly it's a very topical issue. It's wonderful to be able to discuss these matters with our speakers. Olivier, we'll start with you. A very simple question. We have a number of issues in terms of the programming of projects in this area. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a very good question. We are currently drafting BPE3. That is something that's been underway for quite some time. We have held discussions in 2023, and there were several rounds of consultation in 2023, 2024, and we launched the consultation exercise on BPE3. So when it comes to photovoltaics, we have this framework, and the goals are 75 to 100 gigawatts by 2035, I beg your pardon. So we'll multiply things by 2 or 3 over the next 10 years. And if you look at the work done by the General Secretariat, we're talking about more than 150 gigawatts by 2050. Now, if we break things down, when it comes to planning, we have 45 gigawatts polluted soils, 45 gigawatts farming land, 12 self-consumption, and the rest on the roof. Out of the 140 gigawatts by 2050, the General Secretariat for Ecological Planning has said that there must be at least 45 gigawatts in terms of farmland. So given what happened in March 2023 with the law on accelerating renewable energies, we're talking largely about agrivoltaics. That gives you an idea of the potential. The potential at this stage is a bit administrative and theoretical because we need to include this in the PP for 2028-35, which is in the course of being drafted. And the document discussed with the Higher Council on Energy, the decree, which will be discussed next Thursday, in just over a week, on the 19th of December, we can see that the share of photovoltaics on the ground is quite small. So work is underway with the various producers and professional organizations to increase this share and attain at least 50-50 over the next 10 years by 2035. It should be 50% facilities on the ground and 50% on the roof. I was about to say that is the goal of our collective lobbying after preparing this new plan. Thank you, Olivier. You yourself are a farmer. You're a co-president of your entity, Agrivoltaisme. And how do you view the future of agrivoltaics? Hello. I'd like to talk about the origins of agrivoltaics. It was the Paris Agreement in terms of fossil fuels, which underscored the role of farming and agrivoltaics. People expect a lot of farming now, and it's important to have this in the law. The idea is to ensure that food production remains the priority. That's essential if you want to understand the potential of agrivoltaics versus the various other possibilities in this area. For us, therefore, it's very important to focus on roofs and artificial areas and then move on to agrivoltaics. Likewise, this should be viewed as an opportunity for society to produce energy on the ground. And it's an opportunity for farmers to develop a new form of production on their farms, which combines the production of food with the production of energy. And this will make farming more sustainable and lasting. And the farmers can also use the electricity. Farmers need a lot of electricity, a lot of energy, and that will be a way of achieving the energy transition on the farms. In other words, everything is very closely interlinked. We're not just adding something that might compete with what existed already. We're talking about something that should become part and parcel of the farming system. And currently, the synergy between agricultural production and sun-based energy, some people are skeptical. In some chambers of agriculture, there's a major debate in this area, and not all farmers seem to agree. Are there fears concerning a drop in agricultural output? This is a totally new area. It didn't appear in the initial law. Agrivoltaics was not even mentioned at the time, particularly agrivoltaics on the ground. And it's the farming industry that said if we should include agrivoltaics as a principle, but on a different basis. We need a lot of innovation. We need a lot of research, of course, but the idea is to aim at the future. There is a risk because you add the production of energy to farmland. You might think that they would be in competition, but no, on the contrary, there should be a form of synergy. One is not to the detriment of the other. You can protect against sun, wind, rain, what have you. They can be complementary. And then there are different approaches, of course. It's normal that, farming is highly diversified in France because of the soil. Soil differs from one region to another, for example. So the agricultural world doesn't have the same approach depending on the area. When there is a heat wave, when growing vines and fruit trees, it can be very beneficial to have agrivoltaics. And in some other region, the constraints may be totally different. protect crops against too much hail or too much rain. Thank you. You are the General Manager of Sun Agri. Finally, there has been a decree which lays down certain rules. Some projects encountered a problem of acceptability. In Sun Agri, did you encounter this kind of problem yourself? We have projects where there are quite a lot of questions being asked in the field. We are a pioneer in agrivoltaics. The initial projects gave rise to a lot of enthusiasm. They said it's wonderfully innovative, it's a good way to adapt to climate change. Now people ask us about the difference between photovoltaics and agrivoltaics. What is the difference between ground-based energy-producing units when you have sheep grazing, for example? And then there's another issue, which is how to share the value. Who's going to earn money? Who's going to benefit from the system? In the Eastern Pyrenees, for example, the situation is critical for the farming world. A redistribution of the profits reaped by energy producers. I'm being quite upfront in the way I described the problem. What about the sharing of profit? And we heard some figures earlier on. You can see the volume this may represent in France in the longer term, and particularly for regions which may suffer from drought. What kind of planning should be implemented? What will be the impact on landscape? French farming is a way of preserving landscapes as well. And in the various parts of the country, in the territories, agrivoltaics has been defined in the law. Now the question is how it will actually apply to the various territories. And I think people tend to focus on the three questions we've mentioned. Could you describe your approach, your model? Has your model evolved? Our model has indeed evolved. Our approach is defined in our mission, find solutions to adapt to climate change. At Sun Agri, we try to help people adapt to climate change on farms. Our approach is to look at results, to learn from experience. We have a lot of people experts in agriculture and elsewhere, and we try to learn a lot from the results we have achieved so far. That's very important. We can provide proof because there's a lot of mistrust, as I mentioned earlier on. And finally, what's the meaning behind these projects? I think that really helps to distinguish between a photovoltaic project and something else. We have a given mission. We lay down certain aims for each project. We work with farmland, and we have a very roots-based approach. We are there on the spot. We have a community of sun farmers who work with us, and the idea is to be very pragmatic today. Also, there's a last point. We work on the basis of partnership. The results, these technologies, are things that we share, and a number of people in the audience might like to work with us. We function on the basis of partnership. We work with a lot of energy producers, and this technology is designed to be shared for the sake of agriculture and farming. Thank you. It was important to have a scientist as a member of this round table. People are asking all sorts of questions, so it's often good to turn to science. People wonder about output. Are these concerns about output legitimate? Yes, they are legitimate. Farm production consists in changing sun energy into biomass. And with agrivoltaics, you have a solar panel which gets the light first, and the remaining light then is used by the crops. So you might think about farming in the shade, which would produce even more than crops in the sun, but that's not the case. That's not how things work. When plants end up in the shade, you modify their way of functioning. We have quite a lot of experience in this area. We've been working on the economics of crops in the shade for agroforestry and various other areas. So we're not just starting out from scratch. But the shadow cast by photovoltaic panels is different from normal shade cast by a tree, say, on a field. The clouds, the shade afforded by panels is different. So that becomes complicated from the plants. It's hard to go from full sunshine to the shade and vice versa. So the output tends to drop a little bit. Sometimes the output is even better under solar panels than without. But usually there's a slight drop. When you think about the rules and regulations, like the regulations introduced in France, the rule is 90% of the output should be upheld with the solar panels. And it's very difficult to impose that on a farmer. So we are making progress. We have references. We have more and more evidence, more proof. Last year, we published 50 scientific articles. There'll be a new publication with over 100 scientific articles. So we have any number of publications now. Things are moving forward, but it's clear that you can't have conventional photovoltaic facilities above a crop, except in exceptional cases of plants that really need to be protected from the sun. And last point that one has to realize, even if you have a very good result with a crop under solar panels, it doesn't mean the farmer is going to want to grow that every year for the next 30 years. So you have to size the system in such a way as to make it compatible with crop rotation. Even with a vine, if you grow vines, you may move on subsequently to something different. So you have to be able to adapt the system. You say these panels are not conventional. What are you thinking about? Panels that can be moved? Yes, there are all sorts of possibilities today, and that's what's extraordinary without agrivoltaics. There are lots of technologies which are coming on the market. There's semi-transparent panels. The cells are disseminated. There is much more dissemination of light. So there's more light for the crops, which can thus adapt better. You can obviously talk about mobile panels. These panels are designed to give light to crops when they need it. For cereals, for example, it's 1 month after flowering that the plant needs to have a lot of light. So there we have to sacrifice the output of electricity, but for the sake of the crops. If the output drops too much, net farming margins in France are so low that it wouldn't be worthwhile for the farmer to continue growing his crops. So that just doesn't square. It doesn't work. They'd give up farming, and we have to avoid that. When you talk about output, which needs to be very good or might become less good, it's under what circumstances? That's the problem with farming. Every year, the climate is different. Every year, you have to deal with different weather constraints, weeds, and so on and so forth. So with agrivoltaics, there's always a competition for light between the panels and the crops. And sometimes there are some very favorable impacts on crops, protecting them from the cold, the hail, or the heat, or the drought. It's only when these events occur that the impact of the panels becomes positive. So our approach to agrivoltaics and crop output, well, it depends on the frequency of negative events for crops, which are counterbalanced by the panels. And that's what we do. And in the case of climate change, the number of events will become more frequent, so agrivoltaics will become ever more relevant as the climate changes. Thank you very much for this first round of contributions. Now let's see if there is one model or several models of agrivoltaics which we could describe as acceptable and sustainable. What, for you, are the criteria of a good agrivoltaics project? Well, the criterion is that you have to base yourself on the food production side, and you have to adapt the technology in the panel according to what you want to grow, as said. Plants, or the way plants are grown, will be different depending on whether they're panels or not. And we have to ensure that food production remains the same. this is how people will judge for agrivoltaics projects. Some projects may be called into question because the food output drops. So we're, as stated in the law, we're talking about an agricultural project. It's not an energy project, it's an agricultural project. It depends on the crop, it depends on the region, it depends on a whole lot of other criteria. The solution here in Montpellier won't be the same as in Strasbourg, but we have to base ourselves on the farmers. The idea is that things must be able to evolve. Because of nitrogen depletion or what have you, crop rotation, crops will change from year to year. And we're talking about 20 to 30-year projects with agrivoltaics, and a farmer won't grow the same crops for 20 or 30 years. He also adapts to market demand and climate change. So we truly have to ensure that the developers, the energy producers, start with the farming project and adapt accordingly. Otherwise, we'll run into failure, and that's what we don't want in terms of acceptability. If there are some failures, if some people try to do too much or produce too much energy right from the start, others will end up having a poor vision, a poor view of these projects. That will have an impact on agrivoltaics in the future. People will say it's just any old thing, it doesn't work. We're talking about a new technology. Let's hope that evolution in panels makes it possible to guarantee or improve the food production. But we have to move forward step by step. To avoid failures, should one wonder about the sizing of an agrivoltaics park? What kind of power are we talking about? The maximum power, for example? Well, it depends on the area. You won't have the same output if you're talking about fruit trees or grazing. The maximum project is about 20 mega, but it depends on the project. With market gardening, wine and fruit trees, you can have a very high figure. With grazing, perhaps less. The goal, once again, is to have a project which matches the farm. You don't want to have too big a project because that might have a negative impact on the actual farm. Because you'd end up trying to produce energy first and foremost and then just adapt to the agricultural aspect. No, on the contrary, you have to do the reverse. The size of the project must remain very reasonable. We're talking about sharing profits too. The idea is to enable a maximum number of farmers to benefit from the development of agrivoltaics. Thank you. France Renouvelables. What are the characteristics of a good, sustainable, acceptable agrivoltaics project? Well, there are three characteristics if the project is good. You mustn't forget that above all it's an agricultural project, then it's an energy project and an infrastructure project. This is a facility, an infrastructure you're going to create in a given place. You've worked with the farmer, with the energy producer, but above all, this is a new infrastructure on the farmland. Like all new infrastructures, the project has to be well suited to the area. You have to work with the farmers, the citizens, and the locally elected people. When it comes to renewable energies in France, when there's no consultation, experience shows that things don't work. The specificity of agrivoltaics projects, one tends, of course, and the decrees focus on this. People try to move really fast in their discussions, but one shouldn't forget that there are other players involved, locally elected people and people who live in the area in general. Second important point, and that was ably stated, we're still in the learning phase and will continue to be in the learning phase for quite some time to come because the results of experiments and research work, these are things which measure the medium and long term in order to reach very robust conclusions. So when you put together an agrivoltaics project, all the skills involved in the project, and in particular legal and financial experts who are necessary in this kind of project too, they all have to be involved, and they all have to design a model which can adapt over time. That's very important. When you actually design this kind of a project, there has to be some room for maneuver in order to readjust, to adapt the project to an evolving situation in terms of the crops grown, the results of research in the future, because we're talking about 20 or 30 years ahead. It seems stupid to state all this, but for all of you who have completed projects, the project design with some room for maneuver to make the project adaptable on a regular basis, that is something which is an innovation in itself. That's the second point, which is extremely important to underscore. Third important point, we have the sharing of value. Of course, these questions are essential. They are essential, and they should be adapted to an agrivoltaics project. As we have said, an agrivoltaics project is a project that combines the diversification of income for farmers, adapting to climate change, and attenuation of climate change. The project combines all those three aspects. Agrivoltaics is the way this is construed in France. Well, the project, according to the legislator, has to combine all these three aspects. And the farmer must be integrated in the specifics of all these projects. And if all that is done, things usually work out quite well. Question DUPRAZ. Given the work you have conducted, what do you view as a really good project? Well, a good project is a project where a farmer is happy. That means that the crops are happy too. If the farmer is tempted to do something different, then it's simply not working. We have to offer farmers things that are acceptable, feasible. They shouldn't be asked to do the impossible. For me, given the knowledge we currently have, with the majority of crops, you need a project where the energy producer accepts perhaps an output that is slightly lower than with other forms of photovoltaic power generation. For us, given the results, one shouldn't go beyond 20% of coverage, 2,000 meters of panels per hectare. A lot of energy producers say this is not possible. We can't have a system which is financially viable with that coverage rate. But it is possible. I think, therefore, we have to take the necessary time for people to improve their systems, rethink things. When I talk with energy producers, I realize that it's the people who create the structures that hold the panels in the field. It's those structures which play a key part. That's what they constitute the additional cost when it comes to panels positioned elsewhere. If the cost of these supporting structures drops, then I think things will be more readily adapted. We have 30 million hectares of farmland in France. So 20% coverage rate with 100,000 hectares is better than 100% coverage in half the area. So the project may be a bit bigger, but you have to respect the crops. So the energy producers have to find the solution that's financially viable. We'll talk about this with another member of our panel, but I saw another of our colleagues reacting. 20% of the cultivated land, is that really an issue? Just to sum things up, we're not talking about business as usual. That was said quite clearly. Each person has to look about the structural costs, how they go about their work. Structural costs are essential in an agrivoltaics project, but there are two other points too. The structure, As I've said, they represent quite a cost. In these projects and in general with renewable energy projects, the more we manufacture things in France and in Europe, the better we will fare in terms of acceptability. So we have to find this happy balance. Obviously, we'll have to agree that the infrastructure may be a bit more expensive, and also there is the linking to the network, to the grid. There again, it may create inequalities in the farming world, because not everyone is as close or far from a given grid. So basically, the idea is to optimize the situation, and that's how we'll be able to deliver the message, because some projects may take 5 or 7 years to be connected to the grid. Olivier? I agree with what was said. And here, I will speak more as a representative of the agricultural world. Obviously, we have to try and develop systems which are less costly over and above the issue of the percentage of coverage. But what is the main issue is the cost of this kind of energy in the energy mix of the future. That's very important because the citizens, our economy, need to have affordable energy. If our citizens are said, well, agrivoltaics energy is going to cost more than other forms of energy, well, they may say, well, then what's the point? We're paying money to big financial groups. You have to strike a happy balance. So I hope that work will be done in this direction, scaling back costs so that the overall price of the energy drops. You talked about happy farmers. Yes, it's wonderful. A farmer is happy when his crops are developing and growing nicely. But we're not talking about bad farmers if the output isn't good. Our problem sometimes is that their production costs are higher than the market can bear. I think that these projects are a way of adding value for the farmers to their agricultural output. That will make a happy farmer. Farmers will continue with a project because they earn money from it, and that helps to even out the situation in terms of purely agricultural produce. Now, with your experience, what do you view as the right models? Unless you want to react to the conversation we've had so far.
I think the best solution that we've found is to use existing technologies that have already been tried and proven. And at the same time, with a coverage rate of 20%, which is quite high. So this means that it's extended in a homogeneous way across the plot. The danger of going towards the 20% is that if there's too much spacing, there are issues related to freezing, for instance. And if it's densified to 40%, the panels have to be inclined, sloped, and so this becomes an agronomical priority. And so you have to accept losing electric productivity as a result. So we have to be looking at these two areas. We have to accept a share in values, first of all in terms of light. This is very important. There's also a question in relation to cover and height. If we want to be able to transmit sufficient spread, we have to accept this. And so are we looking about the type of material that it's made of? Is it going to be metal? Is it going to be wood? And these are the kind of questions today that we need to innovate on. And so ever since I've been involved at Saint-Lacry, we decided to really put all our resources into getting the right kind of mix with agronomical piloting and other forms of piloting. We can't just use any old type of cell structure. If we want to adapt to the rotations, if we want to be agile. So we think today that if our solution is going to be able to propose something concrete, we're going to have to propose a combination between soft and hard techniques. And so we also have to internalize competence, because today in agrivoltaics, there is not enough volume in the market to be able to propose something which is of interest to both sides. So we need to be able to work at height, for example. We need to work with sun trackers. We've got that choice. Otherwise, we're working with other types of specialists who won't be used to working at height. And so this is one of the issues at stake. We can't work effectively without thinking very clearly about this structure and agreeing to the fact that we're going to have to change the production rate. We need a certain amount of volume. And this is where the equation is difficult, because to be able to plan properly, you have to have the courage to plan, to say what volume you're talking about in order for a real industrial sector to be created. As of that moment, there's a lot of question as well in relation to the operations. It has to the difference between a classic system and other forms. So you have you have farmers, you have the phytosanitary treatments, and these also have an impact on maintenance. It may cost a little bit more, and beyond the investment and the structure, there's also the question of an operation which fits in with something which is relative, pertinent, and can propose an electricity at the same price as on the roof. And this is why it's complicated at the moment to be able to propose panels, semi-transparent panels, because the weight and the cost compared to the steel that's needed for supporting means that we can't really get to the right level. So we have to make sure that the panels are well orientated, in which case we could be much more profitable. And so there's no one single solution. We need to use all our expertise. With cherries, for example, it won't necessarily work for all varieties. For wine, for instance, Chardonnay would work in one way, and then other types of wine would be less successful using agrivoltaics. I think we have to be very open about this. I think we have to really make sure that we have the right kind of agronomical advice. And this is the way we're going to create the right kind of model. I don't want us to withdraw from the fact that we are at an innovative product. We're still testing it. We know that it works, and we can do research in the area, but we need to work on what we have good results on. We're able to control it in terms of the results. The Chamber of Agriculture is working on the agronomical side, and we should be able to state what is working well, and to make sure that we get the right kind of data, to make sure that we know what works for what type of crop, and without which it's going to be difficult to develop in any kind of sustainable way. DUPRAZ, I see you've got your mics in hand. Is that because you'd like to come back on this point? Yeah, just a couple of things here. With our members who are committed to this subject, there are two transformations, organizational transformations in process. Breeding, for example, we have one in Grenoble with people involved in energy. Historically, we have a number of members who are making up our groups, so 5, 8, 10, 12 agronomists in our teams as well. And we can see that it's an illustration of what an agrivoltaics system really is, as opposed to a pure voltaic system. This is the first trend. The second trend, which is not as marked, but which we are seeing among some of our members, is the integration of the engineering side for trackers, support, etc. And here we can see that a lot of people are coming in and saying that we have to invest in this area, because the way that we pilot the trackers, for example, is going to be very important. There are classical trackers which exist elsewhere in the world where there's no crops involved. It's not the same concept. It's not the same form of piloting or steering. And so this is why it's important, and this does illustrate what we're talking about, the importance of being very clear about what we're trying to produce. In terms of acceptability, there's a look as well of the plant. And so I want to talk about a case that we worried about here in Montpellier. We had a validated project here in one of the communes around Montpellier, which was refused for aesthetic reasons only by the elected representatives, because it was a little bit like a pylon in steel. This is how it was seen by people. And the very first prototype that was set up in Montpellier with Sonabri, and this was in 2010, had a wooden structure. And this wooden structure was absolutely everybody was absolutely convinced that this was the ideal form. My hope is that we're going to be able to lighten these panels. They're heavy today, and there's work to make them half as heavy. So this means that we have less solid structures. It's very important for agrivoltaics. It's one aspect. The other aspect, which hasn't been mentioned so much, is the French law says that the installation has to take only 10% of the soil, so 89% of the surface has to be cultivated or under breeding. And when we look at about 100 different projects in the Occitania region, in the south of France, almost no project manages to respect that 10%. It's complicated. It's not that easy to have projects which leave 90% of the land to agriculture. I think the figures that we're getting are from Germany. We're in France here. We have a percentage everywhere in France. We have to have special bans for access to the fire brigade, for example. And unfortunately, it's already difficult to get people to agree. But in addition to that, we tend to introduce regulatory obligations, which make things even more complicated, where you have to have special routes, for example, for the fire brigade to get in. So this is also a question of being pragmatic. I think that the administration has to be able to adapt. If everybody is going to be adding in their little point of view, we're never going to be able to come to a conclusion. So it's a new sector which needs to adapt, which needs to grow. We need to learn. But once again, this mustn't happen to the detriment of the sector in general. Marie, you were talking about Cécile Marie, you were talking about the good results also in major crops. Yes, our first trials were carried out this year on maize, and we've got our ideas about the crop rotation, which is the best depending on the region. And we started with market gardening, for example, with some very good results. Today, we were looking at the possibilities for major crops. And so we've widened our know-how in terms of the structures, the area covered, the modeling for each plot to be able to extend it to main crops. It's not just a few specialists who are interested in this area. And so to come back to what we were saying earlier, there is a structure which of continuous cropping. There are the typical metal structures for the panels, and each of these has its own type of piloting system depending on the objectives that are set by the farmer. For each of these projects, there has to be compatibility with the machine side of farming. This is going to have an effect on density, and we need to be able to ask questions about the fact that if we have a wine structure, we have to make sure that we have the right kind of spacing to allow for the machines to get through. And for main crops, there are going to be, if there are posts, for example, we won't be able to treat the crops in the same way. In terms of density, there are no excuses here. The fact that we have a structure in the middle of a field, for example, for this to be compatible with the agricultural process, we have to think about the project more deeply. Thank you very much. Okay, we're going to be talking now to sharing values, about sharing values. And there are quite a lot of you here. There are quite a lot of questions as well. But Michel, Gloria, okay, we've understood from what you said right from the outset, it's important to put the accent on sharing values. Is this really the key? If we're going to move forward on agrivoltaics, there are several keys in actual fact. If we go back 2 years, 2.5 years, in terms of consensus for agrivoltaics, was in terms of planning, accelerating, and redistributing. That was basically the 3 main areas of action. Planning, as we said right at the beginning, is in process. We're working on the acceleration. It's taking more time to get through. We haven't managed to accelerate yet. I think we were reminded of this yesterday when we had meetings with the people on the electric side. And in terms of value, it's in progress. On these 3 subjects, which are what the parliamentaries, representatives have put together, and this comes out of a political consensus. So in terms of sharing values, there are regulations which say that each project has to contribute to something like 17,000 euros in terms of megawatts to finance projects of energy transition in a certain territory. This article today has been changed because the regulations are not quite adapted. But in terms of agrivoltaics, there are 3 main pathways, which is it's a specific subject. The first of these pathways is that this electricity is useful to the people who are not too far from the project, so the operator for the property, for example, and the people living nearby. So we're looking at self-consumption or preferential tariffs for local people. The second is a pathway which makes it possible to link, and this is very important, the emergence of an infrastructure in a territory and the usefulness of this infrastructure in relation to the people who are close to it physically and visually. And this is really something which is important. If we look at all the different opinions in all the different forms of technology, it's important to create a link between what appears in a new area and its direct usefulness and uses for the people around. People who are working on heat networks have been able to accept share these values in particular. It has to be either expressed in terms of preferential tariffs or self-consumption. The other aspect is what relates to the value of the land and the way that this value is shared. It mustn't be something which is only between the owner and the energy providers. We have to open up an area of space for sharing values for the operator, the energy people, and eventually the people who live in the surrounding area. This is not easy, but we need to, in working jointly together and from a legal point of view, we do manage to share values well-distributed values amongst the people concerned. The final point, which is important in terms of sharing values, is everything which makes it possible to finance something which is collective. So the collective aspect, either is it on the scale of the department, for instance, with various forms of financing from the Chamber of Agriculture, for example, or other sources. Or this may relate to the needs for the agricultural world to adapt. There has to be discussion about this. There has to be discussion between the different actors in the territory to determine what the needs are, the way so that these projects are financed. Or alternatively, are we looking at adapting farming in relation to these projects? So these are the ways in which we have to make sure that we ensure the sharing of values. As of this point, when we do share values, there has to be value. This is the first point. And the construction of these values has to be carried out with a business plan which makes it possible to sell electricity at a price which is competitive. Because on the other side, we have consumers, and these consumers have to be able to find that it's worthwhile. So the project has to be used properly wherever. So who is this destined for? So this is becoming a territorial issue, in fact. Absolutely. I think the difficulty is that we're giving value to something as sunlight, which is a common good in a sense. And when you produce an agrivoltaic project, you transform this, so you're producing crops, etc., and electricity. If you want to have 50 gigawatts in France, we're talking about 100,000 hectares, which is only 1,000 hectares per department. If we have 100-hectare projects, this is only 10 per territory. So there are few. So there's no beneficiaries by having big projects. These are often people who are very close to the source who will benefit. So there's a lot of jealousy and a sense of resentment and injustice amongst people. If this is not the case, sunlight is everywhere. We can create projects everywhere, the north and the south of France is profitable wherever it is, but the sharing of the operators is complicated. And this is why restricting the size of the project is very important, in my view. The legislators didn't want to do it. Today it's the departments, the chambers of agriculture that are making the recommendations to reduce the size of projects or limit them. But I think if a company gets a refusal for their project, they'll go straight to the law courts to try and deal with the problem. And there is a problem in terms of constitutionality. So this is a kind of difficulty we'll probably come across. And so it's important to have a ceiling, which can vary from one region to another in terms of production systems. But this has to be organized and not somewhat dispersed and ad hoc as it is today. Because legally there is not much coverage. When we talk about sharing values, we're talking about equal sharing, fair sharing. I'd just like to come back to something here, to what you've just said. And this is where you can see an example of the need to think about the development of production which matches what the needs are. For example, with vines, if we want to provide added value, why not just have a normal harvesting? I live near Champagne, the Champagne area, for example, and there people are very much concerned with this. When one of the champagne producers was told that they should put grass between the rows of vines, they said, how on earth can we do this because of the kind of machines that we have? So it has to match, it has to correspond to, in terms of market and marketing. And to say that perhaps we've come back to systems which are slightly more human scale than in the past, and this has to take into consideration the physical constraints of the project. So sharing is really essential. We were talking about 1,000 it's not going to save agriculture. Some people say, okay, we're going to be able to save agriculture thanks to renewables. This isn't the case. But it's important for a certain number of projects really benefit from the agricultural side. The greater the redistribution, the less the government has to pay. So with each layer, we're going to bring in more calls for tender. And so ultimately, it's the state that will pay. The European law only finances energy. It doesn't talk about the development of the territory or any other aspect. It's uniquely focused on energy. And an agrivoltaic is not the same as photovoltaic in terms of yield. We used to think that it was the panacea, and with fantastic projects. But I think we've realized now, and even the politicians would consider that there was plenty of money available on the energy side, so we should exploit it. Another point that I'd like to share with you is the fact of the need for transparency. This has to be shared. It's very important, transparency. Otherwise, we're going to be asking for too much or not enough. The link between owner and farmer is obvious. So they're going to have to do the work of the farmer and find the right kind of balance. Is it going to be 50-50, 40-60? But the people who are going to be doing the work have to make sure that the development of agrivoltaics becomes a kind of rental system. With 3,000 hectares are concerned, people won't hesitate for a moment. We have to make sure that it's an agricultural project which is actually carried by the by the farmer. And so it's sure that we need to have this link, and the link with the territory as well. I defend this because I think with the decree, a decree which was planned, which actually never came up, but was intended to focus on projects. I think that it's important to think about agricultural territorial projects. We're talking about local consumption. We're talking about for institutions, for schools, and we really need to work on that basis. And we have to make sure that this money is going to accompany development and provide solutions for elected representatives in a pragmatic way. Some mayors say that they need these projects in order to build schools. And why not turn to these shared projects that we have in common? If local people are nourished by market gardening projects, and they can also benefit from the energy produced by agrivoltaics, why not set up market gardening projects on their commune, producing food for the children, which will be organic eventually. And this really becomes something of interest in terms of sharing values. And so we're going to move on now. I'm sorry, I know that you'd like to go into this, join the discussion, but I think the heart of the subject really is transparency in terms of the added value and the business plans of the projects. And the only way of doing this is to bring in the territories and ultimately the agricultural world is in the development of these projects, and so they get the dividends, more creating companies, for example. Yeah, I think the most virtuous system would be to do this. And today, to invest in territories, for example, here in the Occitanie, they invest in all our projects. And I think it's a way of a form of redistribution, in fact. And then ultimately, how do we make sure that the owners or the farmers are involved? The idea is great, but in practice, it's not that easy. When we're in a crisis situation, when we have treasury issues, when you have to bring equity into some of these projects, particularly when we're talking about 10 megawatts, this means that the real heart of the subject is to make sure that people enter into the capital in the right kind of conditions. And ultimately, the real value sharing process is to be transparent about this. I'd also like to add a point in relation to the value of projects related to transmission. While I was preparing our discussion today, I realized that there are a lot of agricultural lycées, high schools, for example, looking at having agrivoltaic projects on their farms. And so there is the question of transmission is important, and having added a bonus to projects which favor transmission, which make sure that the farms continue over time, is something which I feel very concerned about. So please do raise your hand if you have any questions. So obviously we've got the mic here in the middle, but we're going to hand you the mic, and so that you can ask your question or make your point. The gentleman at the front here. So if you'd like to introduce yourself. Hello. Yes, can you hear me? Yeah. Well, I had a question. Well, I've got two hats here. I'm arboriculture, and I'm work as an energy provider as well. So I think that we will be able to develop several virtuous agri-PV projects, which are of interest for the operators. Nevertheless, I have a doubt when we're at that we'll manage to do 45 gigawatts between now and 2050 for virtuous presence, and also projects which respect the regulatory side. And so we also talk about the examples of wet zones for humid zones, for example, which is another area. So I'm really wondering about, so that we were talking about whatever was agri-compatible, we would talk about this. In France, there's something like 800,000 hectares of agricultural land, which is operated for biofuels, whose output is fairly low. Should we not be studying this? I know this is a subject which make people smile, but even maybe tens of thousands of hectares which are not used for biofuels. Perhaps we could use these hectares for using photovoltaic. And wouldn't this be interesting from an economic side, which was raised today as well? So we can ask the questions to several of you. The calculation is quite easy. In France, the area is, we're talking about 1,000 dedicated
So to produce the same energy as with agrivoltaics, you need 20,000 hectares. If you convert the watts and have electricity added to the grid through agrivoltaics, it means you can free up a lot of land currently used to make green fuels based on agriculture. With 1 hectare of farmland in France, a car can travel 20,000 hectares, 20,000 kilometers. The proportion with agrivoltaics on the ground, you can enable a car to travel 100 times that distance. I agree with what you say. It's just a question of timing. We need this first generation, and you will note that we've just signed Mercosur. It's a Mercosur with agri-fuels. They'll flood us with agri-fuels and GMO crops. We need a first generation, and then we'll see. If we electrify a lot, we'll see. The parameters may change. I'm not very worried about the actual surface area of the that's involved in these agrivoltaic plants. It's about 1,000 hectares per department. It's a very small amount, and 25 years is a long period of time. By 2050, well, who knows? Maybe we won't need biofuels anymore because we'll have found some other solution. And we'll be able to free up the land. Thank you very much. A question from the middle and then from the sides. Philippe Vernet, I come from the Drôme in Haute-Savoie. Two observations, and then I'll put a question. First observation, I don't think there's always a competition between farmland and electrical energy, land used to produce electrical energy. We can use some farmland by create and use that farmland, which is abandoned by farmers, and use it for agrivoltaics. Now we are recreating areas which are used to produce energy, plus to grow crops. Photovoltaics can also be used to catch water. Say 1 or 2 meters from the ground, you can have a little channel which takes the water, the dew, or the water that is formed on the panels, and directs that water down to the ground where it can be used for the crops. Another question, which I'd like to put to our researchers, you talked about crops that like to be in the shadow. Flowers and certain kinds of flowers, which I grow in the Haute-Savoie. They like the shade and they like humidity. So you could grow things under the panels, for example, and grow some kinds of flowers and crops. What kind of crops like shade? Tea, coffee, cocoa, for example. They're not European crops. We're not yet growing them in Europe, but these are the kinds of crops that like these conditions. The biggest agrivoltaics project I know of so far is the Chinese one, of course, for growing goji plants. It spans about 10,000 hectares. Crops that tolerate shade don't make a lot of biomass. If you make a lot of biomass, the slightest amount of shade will reduce the biomass. So we're going to talk about small fruits. Flowers, that's a good idea. But for the flowers to be beautiful, at a given point in their cycle, they will need a lot of light. One shouldn't believe that if you buy a plant in a nursery and you put it on the terrace in the shade in your house, it may not look so good because, in fact, it will have gotten lots of artificial light in the nursery. Some people say, well, what about asparagus? Asparagus grows well in the shade. That's not true. Asparagus needs an awful lot of light during the preceding year to store a lot of energy to produce all the sprouts, which is what we then cut and use. But small fruit, plants with a lot of leaves, some root vegetables too. Thank you very much. Are there questions on the two sides of the room? Yes, the gentleman over here. Please introduce yourself.
Bonjour. Je travaille à l'agglomération du Pays de l'Or, donc les voisins du territoire.
I work in the neighboring department, and I have a question to some of the speakers. Do you have some advice for locally elected people when it comes to the development of this kind of project to make up for certain gaps in the regulations? We'll ask Michel or Cécile to give you an answer there. Olivier? Michel. What we have noted is that you have to be very clear about what people want. That makes life easier for the project leaders. So in terms of locally elected people, projects referring to the climate, the territory, all the territories where there's a lot of dialogue between elected MPs and project holders. These are territories where territorial plans have been well formulated and where locally elected people, after discussions with the others, then decide to move ahead on this or that project. So if I want to advise a locally elected person, I would say, well, do the job set out in your plan in the area of renewable energy, climate adaptation, etc. You have to be demanding and positive with project managers who come to your territory, whatever the kind of the project. With agrivoltaics, that's something which I believe is very important. This is a project which involves the agricultural world and energy producers. And this is the kind of project which has to be broadened to locally elected representatives and people who live in the neighborhood. Thank you. I'll take perhaps one last question. It's very complex to get all the information. AMF 34 provides training. Perhaps we could encourage the AMF to ramp up skills in this area. You give views on projects, and you need to know what we're talking about. That's my first point. Second, there are some landmarks here. Here's one which is an AFNOR label when it comes to agrivoltaics. Elected people should realize that there are some references when it comes to the quality of projects, and AFNOR can certify a project that will help you and guide you in your work. One question on the left-hand side. Then we'll have gone all around the room. I'm a farmer, and I've been looking into agrivoltaics for some time now. I'd like to say, first of all, that we already produce energy, because food is energy. That's my first point. Second, the idea is not to overly reduce agricultural production. That's true. But over the last 2 years, look at what has happened and look at the overheads for a farm. So on the contrary, perhaps agrivoltaics is a way to enable farmers to remain on their land, because if we do nothing, they're going to end up leaving their farms. In our area, there are a lot of windmills with lines built only for these wind farms. We're 20 kilometers from a key wind farm structure, and there's a problem of adding lines to bring energy from one part of farmland to the grid. So we should perhaps optimize the grid in order to avoid using up land for senseless reasons. That's a very interesting point, is the complementarity between the production of various types of energy. That, in theory, should make it possible to optimize the links to the grid. So you could add various sources of energy, put them into the same line, and often one place doesn't produce energy at the same time as some other place, so you could optimize the linkages to the grid. When it comes to the SDER, we'll have a new plan for 2025 in 2 months, and this is a blueprint which involves about 100 billion investment in the grid for RTE by 2040. These amounts are huge, in other words, and the idea is to optimize costs, to do what you've just suggested, perhaps to pool infrastructures, to pool them among several different projects. Thank you. I think we can give a strong round of applause to all those who have contributed to this roundtable, which was of a very high standard. Thank you very much. Thank you for having attended, and I look forward to seeing you back in the room very soon to talk about renewable energies and storage.